comes from a lot of different places for us. But there is one thing that consistently catches our attention, and it gets us up on our feet and cheering. That would be a great underdog story. Now, this idea of an underdog is quite possibly the best oxymoron there can be. But still, it inspires us to see these nobodies somehow become somebodies. And there is nobody who loves underdogs and roots for them to overcome impossible odds more than God, with possibly the exception of any Cleveland sports fan. We have seen that as God continues his plan to build this nation of Israel, he consistently chooses the most unlikeliest people to play the leading roles. We've seen this in the stories of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, and of Joseph. However, there are few underdogs that are as unlikely a leader as the character that we're going to meet today in the story. After Joseph dies, things gradually get worse for his descendants in Egypt. Those Israelites whom God was using to build his nation. You see, under Joseph's leadership, they had settled into Egypt and they began to grow in numbers. After Joseph died, they didn't have that mediator anymore between themselves and the Egyptians. Their numbers had grown so large that the new Pharaoh began to fear that they just might take over their land. So, to maintain his power, Pharaoh enslaved the Hebrews, and he put cruel slave masters over them. They were forced to work from sun up to sundown, building massive structures like the pyramids. So, what happened to God's great upper story plan for these Israelites, this new nation? From our lower story perspective, it appears as if Pharaoh was in control of their lives. Did this turn of events take God by surprise? Well, by now you should know that the answer is no, not at all. In fact, over 500 years earlier, God had told Abraham in Genesis 15:13, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there." Now, so far we've seen that a lot of the real plot of God's story unfolds in ways that seem hidden or contrary to our limited viewpoint. What seems like a long time to us is only a moment for our infinite, timeless Creator. And now, the time had finally come for God to deliver these Israelites and restore them to the path of fulfilling his promise. It was time once again for him to reveal his name, to reveal his power, and to reveal his plan. He just needed the right person. And so, he goes and he calls Moses. Moses is out in the wilderness just minding his own business, tending his father-in-law's sheep, when God comes to Moses in the form of a burning bush with an upper story proposal for him. "Moses, I want you to return to the city, stand in front of Pharaoh, give a speech that essentially commands him to let my people go." Moses, feeling overwhelmed and unqualified, musters up the courage to respectfully decline. He says, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send somebody else." Now, before we come down too hard on Moses rejecting this offer, we need to remember two things. The first one is people fear public speaking more than dying. It is terrifying for most people to stand in front of a group to speak. Anyone here want to come up and speak this morning? I proved my point. Now imagine going in front of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, who thinks he is a god and doesn't like you very much. The second thing we need to remember is Moses had some Hebrew skeletons in his Egyptian closet that he knew would not help his cause. He had burned some bridges, and consequently, he wouldn't be the best candidate to deliver this message. Now we have to remember that Moses had a very unusual cross-cultural childhood. As a baby, he was spared from Pharaoh's death order for all the Hebrew male firstborns to be killed. Thanks to Moses' ingenious mother, his life was spared when she placed him in a papyrus basket and launched him into the shallows of the Nile River, where Pharaoh's daughter would go and bathe. This Egyptian princess, she discovers the baby boy, and her maternal instincts kick in. She adopts him and raises him as her own. He is a prince in her father's palace. When Moses becomes an adult, though, his privileged treatment ends. One day, while he is out walking, he witnesses one of the slave masters abusing a Hebrew. Fueled by his anger, Moses kills that Egyptian, and then he flees out into the wilderness to save his own life. He knows that if he returns to this royal city, he would be executed for his crime before he could even speak one word that the Lord gave him. On top of all this, they say that Moses had a speech impediment and could not talk very well. He had no leadership experience other than being a shepherd. He had no communication skills. He was wanted for murder in a place where God wanted him to go back to deliver a message. Moses sure doesn't fit the profile of a person that is qualified for the job. But we know that God sees things differently. You see, God sees Moses' weaknesses as providing the best conduit for God's strengths. There is no way on this earth that Moses could take any credit, or for those around him to think that his dynamic personality and speaking skills could get the job done. No. The only possible way is through God's divine power and miraculous provision. In our own lives, when we are asked by God the best thing we can do, even when we don't feel equipped or adequate, is to say yes to God. You see, despite Moses' objections, Moses ended up taking his wife and his sons, he puts them on a donkey, and he starts back to Egypt. Back to the land where there is a bounty on his head. And his people toiled as slaves for Pharaoh. He didn't travel by chariot accompanied by a mighty army, but he was on a lowly donkey. He wasn't a great leader. He wasn't a skilled orator or even a teacher, but he was a humble, lowly shepherd. From our lower story perspective, this doesn't make much sense to us for God to choose someone like Moses and trust him with such an important message and an important mission. But our perspective is limited, and we seldom see things the way that God does. If we look forward Isaiah 55, verses 8 through 11, there God says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. As the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and they do not return to it without watering the earth and making it bud and flourish, so that it yields seeds for the sower and bread for the eater, so is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, but it will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it." Moses, he was perhaps the most unlikely person that God could ever choose. But as we'll see, he is by no means the last one throughout this story. You see, our job qualifications are different from God's. While we tend to focus on external stuff like education, work experience, charm, and people skills, God looks at the inside, and he searches for the one and only qualification that truly matters. And that is a willing and obedient heart. Whatever God calls you to do, remember that he will be right there beside you. And so, Moses goes to Pharaoh. He delivers God's message, but Pharaoh refuses to listen. So God sends 10 very ugly plagues. As these plagues unfold one at a time, Pharaoh becomes so overwhelmed by the impact that he eventually agrees to let the Hebrew people go. It is that 10th and final plague that is the most devastating and most revealing. God tells Moses that at midnight, his angel will sweep through the entire land of Egypt and take the life of every firstborn male. But the angel will pass over any house that has the blood of an unblemished lamb brushed across the doorframe. On that night, every firstborn son, including Pharaoh's, dies. Only the Hebrew sons are spared because they listened to Moses. As followers of Christ, we get a sneak peek here at the way in which God will fulfill the need for this perfect, unblemished lamb in order to provide the blood of salvation over the doorposts of our own lives. But I have to stop there. I'm getting a little ahead of myself in the story. It's ironic that Pharaoh's original plan to wipe out the Hebrews by killing all the firstborn sons at the beginning of our story is now reversed and unleashed on his people at the end of the story. In the wake of this intense loss, Pharaoh says, "Go." God allowed his heart to soften just long enough for the Israelites to begin their trek out to the Red Sea. Scholars estimate that between 1 and 3 million Hebrew people marched victorious out of Egypt that day. Stepping back and looking, each one of us may have their own Pharaoh in your life today. Your Pharaoh could be a person, could be a circumstance, or it could even be a conflict that you're in. It may feel like this personal Pharaoh is completely in charge of your life, enslaving you to its harsh demands. I'm here to say, do not lose heart. Don't give up. No matter how high the odds seem stacked against you, remember that in our lower story, it might appear as if Pharaoh is in control, but your plight has not surprised God, as he reveals and enacts his upper story in each of your lives. God is completely in charge and in control. So if you love God, align your life with his upper story plan. God promises that everything is going to work for the good. One way or another, you will cross through the Red Sea as well. God always keeps his promises and will always provide a way through the obstacles that seem insurmountable to each of us. That you can count on. Amen.